Hello everyone and welcome to this week's video session on how to use team velocity to plan your sprints or iterations. I am sure many of you must have heard about the term team velocity, and even if you have not heard it, no worries, we will have a brief refresher around this concept later in our session today to go over some of the fundamentals related to the team velocity. However, the main goal or the focus of this session is how a scrum team or any agile team for that matter can use this team velocity as one of the tools to do the sprint planning. So that is where we will be spending most of our time discussing about. Okay, my name is Ashutosh Deshmukh. I have over 16 years of overall experience in software development work and project management in general. I am both PMI PMP and PMI ACP certified professional. And after I completed my PMI ACP certification back in 2021, since then I have created the practice test for both PMI PMP and PMI ACP exams. These are Udemy courses. These courses are now taken by more than 900 plus aspirants across the globe, and I have an overall 4.6 Udemy instructor rating on the Udemy platform. So, in case if you are looking for getting ready for the PMP or ACP certifications, and if you are looking for the practice test, you may want to check my practice test exams on these certifications on the Udemy platform. And yeah, I will just add the link for the same below the video. So with that covered, let's dive into the agenda for our session today. So, as I mentioned previously, we will start first with some refresher regarding the term velocity. Many of you might have heard about this before, especially if you have been working on Scrum framework. I am almost certain that you probably know what is the team velocity, and maybe you might have even used it during your sprint planning activities. But we will cover a few of the basic concept of it and how it is calculated. After that, we will cover perhaps the most important part of this video session, and that is how, as an agile team, you can use this team velocity in order to do the effective sprint planning. How this team velocity can actually help you to select the right number of stories for your upcoming sprint, right? So that is where we will spend good part of our discussion. So we will discuss about that, and we will wrap up our session with some of the do's and don'ts uh, with regard to the team velocity. As a agile practitioner, I knew that there are some misconceptions or myths about these team velocity, and we would cover some of them as well. Okay, now this slide is more like a refresher, as I said, about the concept of team velocity. Remember, the the term team velocity is a matrix, right? So it's basically a matrix, and it is more commonly found or most commonly found in a scrum. Scrum is, as you probably know, by far the most common agile methodology used in a real world projects, and you will find this concept of team velocity quite common if the project team is using the scrum approach for the project management. And there will be a good chance that if you have come across this term in your PMP exam or PMICP exam, the scenario might mention that the project team is using the scrum. And even if there is no mention of this specific agile methodology, it is probably safe to assume that the project team is indeed using the scrum. So scrum and team velocity are the two, we can say, terms go hand in hand. So team velocity should be used by the agile team or the scrum team in order to determine how many story points or the stories can be completed by the project team in the upcoming sprint. So we talked we as I said, right, we will talk about some of the misconceptions and incorrect interpretations of this term in future slides. But uh, just to keep the things in perspective, the real purpose of using the team velocity is to really gauge or measure the amount of work that the team can complete in a given time frame, typically in a sprint or iteration. So on the right hand side, I have mentioned few, we can say, like a flow, and I have added some details there. And again, this is something very typical on a scrum team, right? Typically in many of the scrum and agile teams, before the sprint begins, for every user story, the project team sits down and do the estimation for each and every story, right? These estimations are done in terms of story points. Remember, story point is not equal to hours or days or weeks, right? So for example, 3 story point does not mean 3 hours or 3 days, right? Story points are relative estimation units, again commonly used in agile, very commonly used in scrum. And the purpose of using the story point is really to quantify the effort, right? Quantify the complexity and the relative size of the user stories within a software development project. So story points are not meant to represent a specific unit of time, right, such as hours and days and weeks, but rather the perceived effort and complexity involved in a completing work. So that's why the story points are, used. So let's assume that the team has done the estimation at the beginning of the sprint, and during the sprint execution, the development team keeps track of the stories which are completed. So for example, if the 2 stories are completed, then the development team may, update the completion status of those stories in some, we can say, project management tool like Jira, for example, which is very common. So in Jira you will mark those stories as done, right? So that's what the team do during the execution of the sprint. And at the end of the sprint, depending on how many user stories are completed by the development team, the team velocity can be calculated for the upcoming sprint. And we will see this example in our next slide. So in this example scenario, you can see that this team is currently working on their sprint number 3. Now this is a hint that this team is in the early phase of their development work. This project team has selected 4 user stories for sprint 3. Okay. The project team has also finished the estimation for each story, and you can see that each story is given an estimation in terms of story points. Now, during the execution of the sprint, as soon as a story is completed, as we discussed, right, the project team members can just update the status of the story as done in the project management tool such as Jira. Now at the end of the sprint, uh, it looks like 3 stories are successfully completed, right, by the project team. However, one user story is not completed. Now, we will not go into the details of why that story is not completed because that goes out of the scope for this discussion. But let's just focus on how the velocity calculation will happen now. Remember, the velocity will be calculated by doing the sum of all the story points of a completed stories. So in this scenario, out of the 4 stories, only 3 stories are successfully completed, and we need to add or sum all the story points of the completed stories. In this case, it will be the user story 1 which is completed, and it has 3 story points. Then the user story 3 is completed, which has 8 story points, and the user story number 4 is completed, which has 2 story points. Now if we do the simple math, the velocity for this sprint will be the sum of the story points of completed stories, which in this case is 3 plus 8 plus 2, which is equal to 13, right? So I hope this is straightforward and simple enough. But one point here is, what happens to the incomplete story? So we said, right, like the story number 2 with 5 story points is not completed. What happened to this story? Now, generally speaking, the development team discuss this scenario with the product owner, and then the product owner can help the team decide if he or she wanted to continue doing the work on that user story in the upcoming sprint, right? So in this case it will be a sprint number 4. So if the product owner decides to continue on user story number 2, then in the next sprint, which is sprint number 4, the development team can complete the remaining pending work for the user story 2. And then when the velocity is calculated at the end of the next sprint, which is sprint 4, at that time the development team will earn the story points which are related to this particular story. So this is how the whole calculation work. Now that we understand what is meant by the team velocity and how the team velocity calculations are done, let us consider an example scenario where there are two scrum teams doing the sprint planning. So here we go. In scenario one, as you can see, the team velocity I have mentioned for the last three completed sprints. So 30, 28, and 25. But you can consider another example where there are more than, say, 5 or 10 sprints completed. But for simplicity, I am just using three completed sprints here. Now, in the first scenario, as I said, right, the team velocity of this team is, only we are considering it for the three iterations, and we will do the like the sprint planning with this data. Okay. During the sprint planning, this team wants to take 6 stories, and the sum of the like the story points of those 6 stories turns out to be 45. Okay. Now, this is where it becomes very important to consider the velocity as a sprint planning tool. Okay. If we look at the data, the team historically has never completed the story points which is of the size 45. So what we can say to this team in this scenario is, guys, historically speaking, we have not completed more than, say, 30 story points before, and we are planning to take the 6 stories whose sum of story point is 45, which is quite on a higher side. Okay, so let's not do that. Let's maybe cut down on 1 or 2 stories and try to take the stories which probably are equal to our average velocity, which is somewhere between 30 to 25. So this could be how the velocity can be used as a sprint planning tool. The other extreme in this case is in scenario 2, right? Now this team has the velocity, again we are only considering the last 3 sprints, right? So in this case the velocity is a little bit on higher side, but of course we don't want to compare the velocities of the multiple different teams, right? So in this case though, the team velocity of the team, again if we consider the average, will be a bit more than 40. But during the sprint planning, this team is going other way around. They are saying they will only take 2 stories, and the sum of the story points of those 2 stories is only 18, which is not even half of the average velocity that this team is achieving in the past, say, few sprints, right? So in this case the team is kind of underestimating themselves. They are probably, there is a room for taking more work for this particular team in the upcoming sprint. So using this team velocity data, we are able to kind of help this project team to pick the right set of stories for the upcoming sprint, right? So that's the main idea here, that depending on the team velocity data, the project team can decide what could be the right size of user stories and story points that they can consider for the upcoming sprint. Now we are not saying here that the team will only be like limited to the velocity which they have seen in the past. So for example, it may very well happen that the team could do in the upcoming sprint more work, or they may finish few, they may not be able to finish all the stories. So it can go either way, and that is why it is important to consider multiple other factors apart from velocity alone when you do the sprint planning. But the point here is using these kind of historical velocity data, velocity trends as they call it often, the team can use it during the sprint planning and avoid the gross errors of selecting the incorrect number of user stories and the story points. So that is actually the takeaway here. Next, let's cover some of the we can say myths about the team velocity concept in agile. In my experience, there are quite a few, we can say, misconception or myths, right, about this team velocity, and I'm sure you might have came across some of these in your experience as an agile practitioner, right? Perhaps one of the most common misconception regarding the team velocity is when, say, some senior executive pulls out the data about the team velocity of multiple teams and then start doing the comparison. I mean, that is totally incorrect. You cannot and should not use the team velocity to compare the performance of the two teams or multiple teams. And there are multiple reasons why it is not recommended. So obviously, there will be a different, we can say, team dynamics. So for example, if you have a team which consists of experienced development members, and if you are comparing their velocity with another team which consists of some newcomers and less experienced members, then this is not a fair comparison, right? Teams have different level of expertise and experience which can impact their velocity. So obviously, a team with more experienced members is more likely to have a higher velocity compared to a team with less experienced members or freshers, because they are still learning their trade. So that's one. The team also works on a different types of projects, features, and user stories, which has its own complexities and efforts, right? So directly, comparing the velocities does not account for these variations. So if you look at the velocity data of the two teams, the focus is not on how, what was the complexity of the stories on which the teams worked. So we are not looking at that aspect of the project here, right? So that's why the comparison of the velocities between the teams should be avoided, or it can, it's not advisable to do the comparison in that way. Okay, so we have to remember that the agile methodologies values the collaboration, the self organization, and continuous improvement within each team. uh, so while sharing this experience and insight with other teams can be valuable, but the direct velocity comparison is often not a meaningful or like a fair way to evaluate teams' performance. Okay, another misconception is that the team velocity always increases in a linear fashion. So in a linear fashion, in a sense that, like for example, if a team starts new, then as the project progresses, automatically or organically, the velocity is almost certain to increase in a linear fashion. Now that's not always true, although it may be possible, right? And in many cases it do happens that some teams velocity might increase in a linear fashion, but again, this is not true for every single team, right? But why so? I mean, like why it is that the velocity not always increases in a linear fashion? That's because velocity is generally influenced by multiple different factors, and its trend can be influenced by things like teams' maturity, or changes in the project team, or changes in the team's composition. The team may face some technical challenge and many more, because of which the velocity is generally not linear. For example, right, let's say, I remember in one of our software development project, there was a issue with one of the software licenses which the team was using. This license got expired, and for some payment issue, the project team was not able to renew this license on time, and this has resulted in productivity loss, and some of the stories which were planned during that sprint, the development team was not able to complete it due to this licensing issue, which is, we can say, like a technical issue. So the graph of the velocity during velocity calculation in that sprint went down because of this technical issue. So it's not always like a linear increase, is what I'm trying to say here. This is one. And one more misconception is, like, higher the velocity means higher the productivity. Again, not true. Okay, so you can take an example, right? So let's say there is a team who finished some simple and easy stories, which are probably lower in priority or less valuable in terms of customers' point of view. The team can say that they might have completed more story points, and thus having a higher velocity during the sprint. But this doesn't mean that the team has been productive in a true sense, right? So a higher velocity might result because of the completing say simpler or easier and less valuable features. So productivity should be measured ideally by the value which is delivered to the users and stakeholders, and should not be measured just because of the just should not be measured only on the story point basis. So let's wrap this session around this sprint planning using the velocity by discussing about some of the tools and don'ts when it comes to using velocity. So I think we have to use this velocity matrix just to do one thing, and that is to forecast how much work the project team can complete in the upcoming sprint, right? So we want to we want to make sure that this velocity is used to ensure that the team do not either overcommit or undercommit, as we see in those example scenarios, right? So we talked about those scenarios where the team had much more data to support that they can complete more stories, but then they were thinking not to pick too many stories to avoid so we should avoid those kind of scenarios like that when you should be using the team velocity. The mistake that the people often makes is they just solely rely on the velocity for sprint planning, and of course that is also not correct, right? So that's one of the don'ts. So although we discussed mainly around some of the areas of how the sprint planning is done using velocity, relying solely on velocity is not the right thing as well, because there are, as we discussed, right, there could be other factors such as the team composition and some of the technical challenges which could influence the velocity factor. So use the team velocity as a sprint planning tool, but don't simply rely only on it, right? So that's what the key takeaway here. We simply can't ignore some of the other aspects of the project, and we kind of discussed about them, like the complexity of the stories, and maybe the dependency on some external teams. All those factors should also be considered apart from considering the team velocity. So I hope the information which is shared in this session was helpful for you to understand. We covered the concept of team velocity and how it is calculated, and how it can be used during the sprint planning, and what are some of the do's and don'ts and some of the myths and misconceptions, and how to avoid them with regards to the team velocity. So if you find this session useful, please give it a like and consider subscribing to this channel. I'm planning to add few more videos related to the PMI ACP and PMI PMP certifications in future. And if you have any specific topic which you want more information around, do let me know, and I will try to make a video on that. If you have any questions or feedback or comments, please feel free to reach out. And I thank you for watching this session.